Okay, good morning and welcome to the first Spartan Talk of the 2021-2022 academic year. For those who don't know me, I'm Professor Sam Chen. I teach here in political science at Northampton, and I have the privilege of hosting our Spartan Talks. And we're super excited to have all of you here with us today, and really excited to kick off our year with incredible talk from one of our distinguished professors here at Northampton. And so we're going to go right in and introduce her. For those who don't know, Spartan Talks is a TED Talk-like platform that we host right here at Northampton. It features our adjunct faculty, who, as you know, are excellent in their respective fields. And today is certainly no exception. And so pleased today to have Professor Longo Johnston with us, who teaches in history. Professor Johnston has served both as an adjunct professor here at Northampton and previously as assistant dean in the School of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. She has taught everything from modern Chinese history to modern U.S. history, as well as U.S. History 1, U.S. History 2, the Civil War Reconstruction, foundations of modern European history. And in addition to teaching here at Northampton, she also teaches humanities at the Pingree School in New Jersey. As you can guess, Professor Johnston is a proud daughter of New Jersey. So proud that she refuses to answer me when I ask her to choose between Wawa and Sheetz, telling me this is a uniquely Pennsylvania problem and I shouldn't bother a New Jersey native with that kind of question. Fun fact about Professor Johnston that I didn't know, she actually used to intern for Tom Brokaw on NBC Nightly News. And for those of you who don't know that name, you are far too young, so go home and ask your parents. But she resides today here in Northampton County with her husband, her 3 children, and her golden retriever. Her talk today is a fascinating piece of American political history. As a political scientist, this is fascinating for me, but it's also a piece of family history for her. And this is one of the most well-known political feuds in American history that took place right in New Jersey. And it begs the question of when idealism confronts the political machine. When it comes to politics, does one person really have the ability to make a difference? And she'll be talking, of course, about John R. Longo, the legendary political boss who took on the legendary political boss in Jersey City back during the New Deal era. Of course, this was a conflict that drew the attention of everyone from President Franklin Roosevelt to author Upton Sinclair to singer Frank Sinatra. But as she says, it's not simply a David and Goliath story, but it reveals the surprising ways in which individuals can challenge the status quo while maintaining the integrity of their cause. And so with that, I'm going to shut up, and it's my privilege to welcome to Spartan Talks Professor Longo Johnston. Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sam. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks to you. Thank you to Dean Grubbs for inviting me and for including me in something I love so much. I so enjoy Spartan Talks, and so it's very, very cool to be a presenter. So thank you, and thank you all for coming today. This is like the most, 2020, 2021 statement that I could make. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. All right, so when it comes to politics, can one person really make a difference? The powerful forces of things like special interests, bossism, and corrupt patronage can give the impression that it is impossible for a single actor to affect change. The story of John R. Longo suggests otherwise. Longo was the second of 10 children born in 1913 to Italian immigrants who happened to be proprietors of a modest fruit and vegetable market in Jersey City, New Jersey. While he never received more than a high school education, his fearlessness, integrity, and unrelenting principles made him an uncommon political force of nature. For full disclosure, John Longo was my grandfather's brother. He was not simply a family legend, but a legend in New Jersey politics. As Sam mentioned, he was famous for his idealism and his crusade against corruption. So what began with family conversation around the dinner table became an ongoing, extensive academic research project by NCC's own Dr. Pamela Longo, my partner in crime and my fellow researcher on this, and myself, into the national implications of John Longo's fight for justice.
Professor just called my professor.
At only 15 years old, 15, Longo began his political career in Bickford's cafeteria at the heart of Jersey City's Journal Square, which was a bustling transportation hub where he attracted the attention of local immigrants and other first-generation Americans, in addition to shoppers, diners, commuters, people of all walks of life who happened to pass by. Appalled by the indignity of Jersey City's political machine, Longo gave empowered speeches in the middle of the restaurant, in which he railed against Jersey City's longtime mayor, Frank Hague. High taxes, restrictions on free speech and free assembly, election fraud, quality of life restrictions, all resulted, Longo argued, from Hague's abuse of power. According to Longo, quote, Hague proved that it is possible to establish fascism in the name of democracy. Longo was not alone in this contention, as he amassed a following of other scrappy young men from the cafeteria at Bickford's. Even a young Frank Sinatra visited Bickford's almost nightly, historians contend, for 4 years to hear Longo and his compatriots. 17 years before Longo was born, Frank Hague began his political career as a manager for a street gang tasked with intimidating voters who opposed a local boss. Hague was raised in an Irish Catholic family in the Horseshoe, which was a notorious Jersey City slum. He was the fourth of 8 children, so a little bit of a parallel between kind of his upbringing and Longo's upbringing. Life in the Horseshoe taught Hague how to win and to retain the loyalty of his voters. He doled out government jobs, delivered food, paid funeral expenses, and even rode on the fire truck when the local company made a call. All the while, he amassed increasing control over his city ward and ultimately all of Jersey City, becoming mayor in 1917. He would hold this post for the next 30 years. Although he earned an annual salary of $7,500, he ended his political career as a multi-millionaire, the result of patronage, kickbacks, and illegal gambling. Hague gave himself the nickname, I am the law, a reference to his eagerness to defy statute and custom. Hague kept his machine firmly in place by regularly altering the outcome of both primary and general election races, stuffing ballot boxes, and even arranging for the beating of 200 Princeton University students who were assigned to watch the polls in Jersey City. He was brutal in opposing dissent, as John Longo would discover. His critics called him a tyrant, while his defenders hailed him as a champion for the underserved. In order to solidify his power in Jersey City, Hague extended his influence to state government and eventually the Democratic National Committee. He served as vice chair of the DNC for 20 years. As Hague's prominence grew, so did the import of Longo's crusade. In the late 1930s, Longo regularly published letters in magazines like The Nation, calling on, quote, every lover of liberty and democracy in the nation to diminish Hague's influence in the Democratic Party. In 1938, Longo delivered a fervent anti-Hague speech over radio broadcast in New York City to his largest audience. He stumped for Hague opponents. He published evidence of Hague's massive election tampering. This was the last straw for Hague. He had Longo arrested on charges of election fraud. So here we have Longo putting forth evidence of massive election tampering, tens of thousands of votes, upwards of 50,000 votes. And then Hague has Longo arrested for charges of election fraud. At 24 years old, Longo was indicted on 3 counts, 3 counts of filing fraudulent petitions, a claim that he vehemently denied. The charges carried a maximum sentence of 15 years in prison. The judge in Longo's trial called him a quote unquote self-made martyr and chastised him for believing he had undertaken a worthy cause in opposing Hague. The assistant prosecutor in the case mockingly termed Longo a quote, David who thinks he is going to slay Goliath. Longo ultimately served 9 months of hard labor in the state penitentiary. He could regularly be heard from the street proclaiming his innocence to passersby. In violation of penitentiary regulations, Longo's visitors were restricted. He was denied access to his lawyer. He was prohibited from obtaining reading material, and he was deprived of necessary medical care. Throughout the trial and imprisonment, Longo was publicly supported by a disparate coalition of clean government advocates, influential society women such as Ida Guggenheimer, Guggenheim fame, war veterans, labor unions, anti-fascists, and even some communists and socialists, religious leaders as well. Supporting Longo came at a price. For instance, a Jersey City rabbi whose temple was located in a Hague-controlled building lost the permit for his congregation as a result of serving as a character witness for Longo during the trial. The trial appeared to be flawed from the start. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO, for whom Longo had delivered that infamous 1938 radio address, alleged that, quote, the jury had been planted to convict. They highlighted that 10 of the 12 jurors were direct beneficiaries of Hague's organization. Frank Murphy, Attorney General of the United States, interviewed Longo, and in a national address, Murphy alleged that Longo had been indicted on a false charge and denied his civil liberties. The FBI then began its investigation and ultimately amassed enough evidence for 45 federal indictments against Hague. But almost all of the 130 witnesses that they found refused to repeat their stories in open court. They were more afraid of Hague than they were the FBI. The Longo case became a national example of urban machine corruption, or as some began to term it, American fascism. But as quickly as the case came to national prominence, it disappeared. Hague enthusiastically threw his support behind Franklin Roosevelt's third term, a move that destabilized the Longo coalition. What Hague had that Longo and his supporters did not was massive political capital and unrestricted control of the ballot box. Roosevelt embraced Hague's support, eager to capitalize on Hague's hold on the New Jersey electorate. At the same time, Attorney General Murphy was appointed to the Supreme Court and off of the Longo case. And when Longo's case made its way to the US Supreme Court via appeal, the court refused to hear it. A subsequent Department of Justice investigation likewise went nowhere. If precedent held, Longo, like other Hague opponents, would have been crushed politically, the moral wind just taken out of his sails. But Longo's idealism, his steady belief that Hague's actions were fundamentally wrong and inconsistent with the America to which his parents had immigrated, held strong. Longo was inspired by his fellow first-generation Italian-American Fiorello LaGuardia, mayor of New York City, who is lauded today, as one historian said, quote, one of the nation's most incorruptible politicians ever, a paradigm of honesty and virtue in American political history. Longo kept talking, protesting the annual municipal budget, making allegations of fraud and forgery, fighting Hague's 1941 mayoral race, and urging New Jersey Governor Charles Edison, son of the famous inventor, to appoint individuals disassociated with the Hague machine. Hague pushed back. He attempted to silence Longo, this time by changing his military classification in the midst of World War II from 4F to 1A, making him eligible to fight overseas. Army doctors quickly realized that Longo was legitimately ineligible due to a chronic foot injury. Inspired by Longo's tenacity in what Edison called, quote, the fight to bring democracy back to Hudson County, New Jersey, the Republican governor, Edison, appointed Longo, a lifelong but pragmatic Democrat, as deputy commissioner to the Hudson County clerk in 1943. Within months, Hague orchestrated charges of forgery against Longo. The indictment alleged that Longo had altered his personal voting record in the 1941 primary from Democrat to Republican in order to make himself eligible for an Edison appointment. Meanwhile, Longo's political affiliation had no connection to the appointment, and Edison even denied that Longo's status as a Democrat was at all relevant in his decision. And yet, Longo faced 18 months to 3 years in prison. He regarded the charges as so preposterous that he refused to even enter a plea. In typical Longo fashion, he addressed the court and expressed his dismay that the court's priorities were misplaced, saying, quote, "The prosecutor is healthy, the jury appears healthy. Why are they not out manufacturing bullets? There is a war on. I have 3 brothers in the army who are fighting to eliminate what goes on in this city today." After a trial of only 2.5 hours and 1 hour of jury deliberation, a guilty verdict was returned. Like the previous trial, there was a problem. Upon appeal, a Hudson County grand jury questioned why a handwriting expert had not been called to testify. The case rested on Longo's signature on a document. So why then was no one asked to consider its authenticity? The grand jury expressed, quote, "serious doubt that the alleged crime was ever committed." Hague's response was unprecedented, not only in New Jersey, but in the United States. No one had ever done this in American history before. Hague and his officials sued the grand jury for defamation. Despite the fundamental issues with Longo's case, the appeal lasted for years. While the case was still being adjudicated, Longo announced his retirement, though only in his 30s, announced his retirement from politics, acknowledging the toll it took on his family. He told the New York Times, quote, "While I am not ashamed of my past activities, it is true that they have brought me and my family nothing but misery and hardship. I learned to my personal sorrow that in politics, to get along, one must be treacherous, selfish, and hypocritical. All things that Longo said he would never allow himself to be." Still, however, he felt an intense loyalty to his country, telling the Times, "Of course, I still owe to my country a deep interest in public affairs insofar as they affect the winning of the war and establishing a lasting peace." It was this abiding sense of patriotism that ultimately drew Longo back to the fight against Hague. He came out of retirement. While his case was still in appeal, he was brutally beaten in the street, his skull fractured as he was handing out his anti-Hague newsletter called The Jersey Justice. Pro-Longo rallies were forbidden in Hudson County, and yet his case received national attention. The famous muckraking journalist Upton Sinclair wrote Longo a letter of support and spoke out publicly on his behalf. A wide coalition from all over the country contributed to the National Longo Defense Committee to help him afford his legal challenges. It was not until February of 1948 that Longo was fully and completely exonerated. Longo never held elected office himself. This was not his objective. The John R. Longo Association continued to support local clean government candidates and brought issues of civil rights, quality of life, and racial and ethnic discrimination to a national audience. Longo continued to serve Hudson County in various roles, including as a director for the Utility Authority and communications director. He spent much of the latter portion of his life as a journalist, addressing not only politics, but sports. At the end of his political career in 1947, Frank Hague secured the position of Jersey City mayor for his nephew, Frank Hague Eggers. Monuments of his time in office still stood. For instance, the Margaret Hague Hospital, a project named for his mother and funded by New Deal money, a reward for his support for FDR. Roosevelt Stadium, a major and minor league baseball field, also built with WPA funds, its name a reminder of the political alliance that may have saved Hague from criminal prosecution. Though he died a very wealthy man, Hague's name has become forever linked with corruption. Thousands of New Jerseyans gathered for his funeral procession in 1956, but few men removed their hats in respect. And one woman holding an American flag bore a sign that read, "God have mercy on his sinful, greedy soul." John R. Longo passed away in 1994 at the age of 80. While no physical memorials recalled his battle against Hague, he was remembered as an unwavering champion of civil rights, an incomparable independent political force, and a brilliant author and orator. Can one person make a difference? Did John Longo make a difference? Victory takes many forms, especially when we historians have the privilege of looking backward. When Jersey city officials after Hague tried to use Hague strategies to reimpose bossism, they were faced with strong opposition because a precedent had been set over many decades by a young man they called the cafeteria statesman. Longo's story shows that you can fight the machine. You can speak truth to power. You may pay extraordinarily heavy prices for it, and there will likely be massive limitations to your ability to effect change, particularly in your current historic moment. But Longo's story shows that it's possible to fight with values and integrity, and that despite the often corrupting nature of politics, one can still be incorruptible. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Professor Johnston, for that walk through history. A fascinating story. Someone in chat here said, I seriously cannot believe out of my 20 years of living as a fellow New Yorker and Pennsylvanian, but I've never heard of this politically intriguing story. And I think politically intriguing story is a good way to put it. We want to now open up the floor for questions. And so if you have a question for Professor Johnston, please submit it in the chat. You can do that not anonymously, but you can do it by direct chat if you don't want everyone seeing your question. But submit those questions in the chat. I will read those out loud, and I know Professor Johnston is eager to hear your questions or your thoughts, and let's have a little bit of a conversation. And while we wait for those questions to come in, Professor Johnston, let me start the questioning off. As a political scientist, I find this to be incredibly intriguing. I've likened this to the Huey Long era in Louisiana politics. And similarly, those who oppose Long, many of them have walked away from politics and gone into academia as political scientists for fear of that political machine. You said at the end that this is an example that we can stand up to the machine, and yet there's a toll that it takes on us. What's the calculation there, whether it was for your, I guess it would be your great uncle, or for anyone else who's aspiring to go into that world? What is that calculation on whether that toll is worth it? I mean, to your point, he withdrew at one point because of the toll on his family. Where does that calculation rest? Is it worth going up against the machine when there's such an intense toll?
That's a great question. I think to a certain extent, all of us might sit with those questions from time to time, like when is it appropriate to speak out in various parts of our lives? When is it appropriate? I think it's something that you mentioned when he decided to pull away in 1943, when he decided, that picture of him in his parents' grocery store, to him, that was about family, right? So when he's kind of measuring things up and he's deciding what's most important here, he was at a rough spot in terms of his family life. His father had passed away. That left his mother, who, although she had adult children, she still had a number of younger children. She ran a business entirely by herself. And this did put the family through a lot. Every once in a while, I think even as adults, his brothers would every once in a while kind of mention like, oh, geez, that was rough. So this was a hard thing for his family. So after his father passed away and he recognized that his mom was kind of on her own with the three brothers in the war, that was a moment when he was going to step back. And so he was not going to put this above his family. He would make sacrifices for himself. He would take that jail time, you know, except being beaten in the street, but he would not put his family through all of this. So I think that was part of his calculation. But then you see how quickly he came back. He almost just couldn't help himself. So I think that says something that's especially unique about him that the average person doesn't do. I mean, he really did give this fight the very best years of his life. He did go on later to get married. He never had his own children. He had a lot of nieces and nephews and people who cared about him and surrounded him like throughout his life. But these were the best years of his life that he gave to this fight. So he sacrificed of himself, but he did draw the line at his family.
Oops, I am muted. Comment here from Dr. Allnut, who also teaches in history, one of your colleagues. First, he says, I see a strong family resemblance. And then he raises this interesting point. He says, now Hague is a local example of what can occur when a figure such as Orban, Modi, or Bolsonaro, which in Israel, takes over an entire country. And scary, he's right. Wondering if you could comment on perhaps what lessons we learned from a local example on the national or international scale. Yeah.
So let me start by saying, thank you, Brian. Hi. It's a fantastic question. So the first thing that makes me think of in the 1920s, when there was a point where Hague was almost handed a Senate seat, that a political friend of his, you know, they were going to arrange it. He was going to get this Senate seat. He was going to become the senator from New Jersey. And he didn't want to take it. He really wanted to be at the local level. I know, granted, he very influential in the DNC. He wielded a lot of power there, but he liked his little kingdom in New Jersey. He was able to wield power. He benefited financially from it. And he was able to be sort of a big fish in a small but very relevant pond. And so I think he understood at least his kind of limitations, that the system that he had created for himself could exist there, but that was not something he was going to be able to kind of parlay into something, at least in the Congress. Now, legislative branch is very different from the executive branch. I think it does make me think that it's what he did was kind of scary. And the strategies that he used, could you employ some of those strategies at the national level? Absolutely, you could. And I think it's probably much easier to do in the 21st century than it was in the 20th. And so I think learning about stories like this, learning how people do this at the local level, where we usually sort of neglect politics, we usually don't pay a lot of attention to local politics. This is the zone of experimentation, right? This is where we see like what works, what doesn't work. This is where we can see people kind of try things out, where politics is much more intimate. Well, now politics is more intimate on the national stage than it was before. So is this possible? Absolutely.
Question here from Dr. Longo, your fellow researcher. She says, I like to build off Corum's reaction. Why do you think the story has not retained the national attention it initially garnered? And how might it be incorporated into a United States history curricula?
So we're going to write a book. No, is that where the questions go? I don't know. That's the hope, is that we could write a book. Why did it kind of fall out of the national spotlight? I think that a couple of things. I think that there were some reasons why it got the traction it did at the time. You hear it when you read people's rhetoric. It's very much rooted in kind of like a World War II. There's a World War II rhetoric here that you hear it over and over again from Longo, from his friends, right? This is fascism. My brothers are fighting the war over there. I'm fighting the same thing over here. He had an exchange in court once where he said, nobody's asking, even Hitler's not asking his people these questions. And so to kind of invoke the current events of the time made this very, very powerful, and it spoke to people a lot in the moment. Hague likewise tried to invoke things like communism. I had the quote up there where he says, if you're talking to me about the Bill of Rights, you must be a communist, to kind of foreshadow a lot of what we saw in the 1950s in terms of the Red Scare. So they were definitely speaking the language of the time. And I think that was a really big part of it. Certainly, Longo's incarceration really did get a lot of that attention. And so he was, after that second time where he was arrested and imprisoned, he kind of backed off a little bit, and then things kind of settled down a little bit. And even he changed his approach slightly so that he wasn't kind of in that same hot seat all the time. But I think it's interesting how local politics fades. And Hague has there are a lot of apologists out there for Hague. There are a lot of books that are a lot of anti-Hague books that have been written, but there are a lot of pro-Hague books out there as well. You can go onto YouTube. If you take a look for Frank Hague, you will get all kinds of positive videos. You will get nothing negative. He was seen as somebody who, it's kind of like Mussolini got the, he got the trains to run on time. So it doesn't matter what else he does. There were a lot of people who felt that he was doing the things that they wanted him to do. He was cleaning up the streets. He was getting the garbage picked up. He was doing all the things that people wanted. And so then they didn't care how he did it. They didn't care if they couldn't freely assemble, didn't matter to them one bit. So I think that kind of, those folks were able to retain a voice. And I do think the way that he used his connection with Roosevelt, that there was such an enduring sense of positivity and in terms of Roosevelt's reputation, that he did try to, he tried to connect himself to that while both of them were alive. And then after Roosevelt's death and Hague kind of hangs around a bit. And so he did kind of get connected with Roosevelt and so was seen favorably by default.
And one correction, and thank you to Dr. Allnut for this. Bolsonaro is Brazil. The others were in Israel. So thank you for that correction. Always have a historian when you host an event like this. It makes life a lot easier. This is a good question that piggybacks on the last one. Do you believe that the story of John Longo and Frank Hague occurred in today's time, that there would have been so much of ignored corruption? Or do you believe that Hague would have been canceled almost immediately?
A great question. And I kind of pose the follow-up, which is, would Hague have been able to cancel Longo first? Because it just seems like something that I think Hague was trying to cancel Longo back then in the very kind of, 1930s, 1940s way that you could cancel a person. It's a really great question to think about. How does this play out? One way that I think about answering that is, what resources did Longo have at his disposal then, and how might that translate to now? So he did use the radio. He self-published his own newspaper. He used other existing publications and just wrote constantly. And then, I said at the beginning, and it kind of sounds crazy, but he got his start just literally like standing on tables in this diner and talking to people, the cafeteria statesmen. And so I think it tells us, it's kind of this combination of how local politics worked, that he had access to people very locally in that very intimate way, but at the same time was starting to use things like the national press that might have given him some additional traction. In today's world, would he get some exposure? Oh yeah, this might have been very social media friendly. Somebody kind of taking a video with their phone of him in Vicksburg. I don't know. But I feel as if, I don't know, perhaps my speculation, and if I revisit this later today with some more deliberation, I might think differently. My initial speculation is that it's easier to cancel someone today than it was back then. But there's absolutely a parallel. I think Hague was trying to cancel Longo. I don't think that Longo had enough political capital and enough resources to be able to cancel Hague. Oh, and one quick thing. I don't know that he would have wanted to cancel Hague. Longo's big thing was the First Amendment. He was furious with Hague for shutting down free speech, shutting down free assembly. And so I don't think that was ever, in anything that I've seen, I don't think his rhetoric ever said no one should hear Hague out.
Very good. I'm going to combine a few questions here. We're getting a few questions on the role of FDR. And so questions here, do you think FDR was fully aware of how corrupt Hague was? And this student asked, it's interesting because I always think of FDR as a good guy. And other students say FDR has always been like a role model. But of course, he's still a politician. And it does seem like being a politician almost necessitates accepting help and support from ethically questionable people. As someone in that field, I can attest to that. We always say don't turn down support. And so the question here is, I wonder if FDR would have gotten elected if he were as staunchly ethical and principled as Longo was. And along those lines, another student also asking, whether FDR or why didn't FDR ever just sit down and have a conversation with Longo and hear him out about Hague? So kind of combining those questions into one.
Well, those are such great questions. We'll kind of jump around a little bit. We have we have a saying in our family that comes from, it's not, all of this comes from academic research, but what I'm about to cite just came from a website. It was somebody who blogged, and it's become sort of just a funny mantra in our family. Poor idealistic John Longo. That's how this person started their blog about him. Poor idealistic John Longo. He never, he did try to run for office, not successfully. He was not the person that, he had too much integrity to be able to do the things that you needed to do. And so I don't know, he was too, I think he was too idealistic. He was a purist, and he believed that the system should be what it was supposed to be. And so he didn't bend rules, and he, so I think that he might have always been, I don't believe in historical inevitability, obviously, as a historian, but I do think that it would have been very, very tough for him to be able to kind of get to that status that Hague had. In terms of FDR, did FDR know what he was dealing with Hague? Absolutely. The Democratic Party knew what they were dealing with Hague. If you go back to, and I'm sorry if I'm not going to get the years right on this. This is, so you have, even before Woodrow Wilson runs for governor in New Jersey, his opposition was an ally of Hague's. And this is very early in Hague's political career. Democrats in New Jersey getting really, really nervous that this young guy Hague, who's known for, what he does, the games that he plays with elections, and they're worried that he's getting too much power. And so they push Woodrow Wilson for governor instead. And so we might, with more research, might be able to make the argument that Hague kind of factors into Wilson's rise to power as well, not because they're connected, but because Hague opposed him. So there were some Democrats very early on who were afraid of him, who were afraid of what he could do. And so they had choices to make about how they were going to deal with him. Early on, when he wasn't powerful enough, they could run candidates against his people successfully. As he grew in power, somebody like Roosevelt has to contend with, what do I do with this guy? You're not going to get him out of there. And Roosevelt did benefit from the way that Hague carried not only Hudson County, but really ended up all of New Jersey. So he didn't want to toss that away. And you can see, when you trace New Deal funding, when you trace money that comes from the WPA to Hague directly, when he builds Roosevelt Stadium, when he builds the hospital in honor of his mom, that he's really trying to ingratiate himself to Roosevelt. And originally he was not a Roosevelt guy. Originally he was an Al Smith guy. And he had to make some pragmatic decisions about his allegiances.
Dr. Alna has a question here. He says, I've done some study on New Jersey at this time. Do you see an ethnic component to Longo's gathering of opposition? I've seen some indications that Hague began to realize his Irish-based machine was too ethnically narrow. And just for some context, especially for a student who may not really get where Dr. Alna is coming from here, especially in this era, the ethnic under a part of politics was very, very important and played a very large role. In the New York City region, they would always say, if you want to run, you need to pass the 3I tests, the Israelis, the Irish, and the Italians. And if you couldn't get those cohorts, you weren't going to win. And the same was true in different parts of the country. And here's the question of, was this a factor in New Jersey during this time?
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Brian. That's absolutely. And I kind of offer this too for students who might be somewhat confused about the party dynamics. Both Hague and Longo are Democrats, right? So this is within the same party. If you were in Hudson County at this time and you were, you were Polish, you were Irish, you were Italian, Republican's a dirty word. Republican means, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, they don't like you, you don't vote Republican. So it has more to do with those kind of affiliations than it does any kind of formal platform. So the politics, it just kind of functions very, very differently. But absolutely, there's an incredibly strong ethnic component. And there's a strong religious component too. So both Hague and Longo come from these Catholic families. And so Longo starts out, the only position he had, the only real job he had was he was the secretary for the Holy Name Society in his church. And so he actually gained some prominence in his church as well. And he was really annoyed. It's one of the things that comes up in his 1938 speech over the radio in New York, he's really annoyed that Hague uses Catholicism to say, oh, come on in, Catholics, I'll take care of you. And here Longo says, he's not devout, I'm devout. I represent Catholics, he's only using them. And so there's that component of it also. But I think in Hudson County, there was very much, especially for the immigrant population or for the children and grandchildren of immigrants, very much a sense that quote unquote ethnic people need to stick together, and that it is the Democratic Party that is going to represent them. And when Hague originally comes in, he tells the Irish folks and the Italian folks, I'm going to clean up the city for you. You see all these problems, I'm going to clean this up for you. And one of the things he does, he kind of fights against stereotype. One of the things that Al Smith dealt with, rum and Romanism, and what's going to happen with alcohol. Hague never drank. He never drank publicly, privately, wouldn't do it because he didn't want anybody to accuse him of kind of playing into a stereotype. But that's a huge, huge factor. And we can have to have a whole long conversation about that. Yeah, absolutely, Brian.
Continuing on that conversation, a question from Mr. Longo, from Frank Longo here. Did Hague take advantage of the immigration that was occurring at that time? And if so, how?
So you've got some changes in immigration during this time, right? So when Hague starts out, you've got an awful lot of what students should know that we call the new immigration from Eastern Europe, from Southern Europe. And then as we kind of move through, there are additional quotas on immigration, so it slows down, but especially in his early political career, absolutely he did. And I think that that in addition to sort of taking advantage, the kind of like old system of political patronage, like you just showed up and I'm going to make sure you have a job and I'm going to put you on my police force and I'm going to deliver food to your house. You will get to know me. You know, I think he absolutely, I always use in my classes the example of like Boss Tweed and Gangs of New York, that he shows up, you know, with the bread and the soup to the Irish immigrants and says, all right, come on in. Hague is doing the same thing. So I think he's absolutely taking advantage of that. I think people like Longo resented that. Longo's parents, they come to the United States, originally come to New York, and are really like amazing, I'm super biased here, amazing enterprising people who work their way up. Michael Longo, his father, begins as, you know, as a street vendor. He's selling coal in the winter, ice in the summer, walking around the streets of, you know, of Lower Manhattan. And is able to work his way up till he can buy his own little store, and he has all these kids, and they did a lot on their own. And that's not to say they were loyal to the Democratic Party for all the reasons we talked about before. But they resented the idea that the mayor is going to show up and kind of take care of you and take you under his wing. Like, these were kind of fiercely independent people, just like John Longo was kind of fiercely independent. And so did he take advantage of that? Absolutely. The other thing that he will start to do, once we start to see those immigration quotas, as we kind of move into like the 20s and into the 30s, when immigration declines, and now the fear is communism, he will try to paint his opponents as communist. He tried to paint Longo as communist. Anybody who, that quote where anybody who, you know, who invokes the Bill of Rights, they must be a communist. And so that really kind of takes advantage too of what's going on with immigrants, especially immigrants from Italy. Now, this would have created a divide between the Irish and the Italians, that the immigrants from Italy were kind of cast as communists, whereas that you didn't have that classification of the Irish immigrants. So he created that divide too.
That's a good segue into this question on the communist aspect of it. A question here says, in the presentation, there was a slide that you had that had a quote from Mayor Hague that stated, quote, "We hear about your constitutional rights, free press and the free speech and the free press. Every time I hear these words, I say to myself, that man is a red. That man is a communist. You never heard a real American talk in that manner," close quote. Considering Hague's extreme stances against freedom of speech, along with his corrupt policies, do you think that Hague only got his power, his support, and success from instilling fear into his voters?
It's a really great question. I think he goes to two extremes. He instills fear for sure. And And so much so, I'm going to digress, but I'm going to loop back. So much so that in March of 2021, there was a zoning board hearing in Jersey City about what was going to happen to the former headquarters of the John R. Longo Association. Was it going to be demolished? It is, unfortunately. But to hear people, residents of today's Jersey City, talk about Hague and the fear that he instilled in people, that even in 2021, people are still talking about the fear, that was absolutely real, for sure. On the other side, if you were in with Hague, you were set. If you were in with Hague, you were not worried. If you were the beneficiary of the job, if you made sure that you were voting for him early and often, you were set. So I think he managed to do both things. And this is why Longo provided that quote, that he's able to take fascism and make it look like democracy. Because here he is saying, no, I'm just a regular old New Dealer, right? I'm just doing what FDR does, right? And so I'm here to, we're going to build the hospital. We're going to do all these great things, right? We're going to make sure the water's clean, all of this. There will be no pornography. Anybody can walk in the streets of Jersey City at any time. So he plays both sides, right? Here's all the good stuff. But don't think that you can go have a rally. Don't think that you can go and publish a newspaper article against me. So there's a cost, even for those who have the benefit of an affiliation with Hague.
Two questions here, kind of dealing with Hague's tactics and how Hague was able to get things done. So I'm going to combine them here. The one question is more about the relationship between Hague and Longo, and whether Hague ever attempted to buy out Longo by offering him a job, which I would add still happens in politics. We still buy people out by offering them jobs. Whether that was ever attempted. And then kind of a good piggyback off that question here is, how do you believe Hague would have acted if different nationality or religion-based communities resided in that region of New Jersey, such as a religion that conflicted his personal beliefs rather than complementing his Catholic beliefs? Seems like a Catholic-based group immigrating in made it seem rather easy to woo them.
Right. It's a very good point. It's a very good point. It's a great question. What I will say was, ultimately, I'm going to answer this kind of backwards. Ultimately, what Longo will do is as the neighborhood diversifies, Longo's coalition gets bigger, not Hague's. So as we move into 1940s, 1950s, all of a sudden, and certainly into the 1960s, which is then kind of post-Hague, Longo's coalition now includes African Americans who are increasingly coming to Jersey City. And so Longo truly believed that kind of inclusivity was number one, the right thing to do, but also necessary. Just get people, regardless of background, even regardless of political party, get people who believe in clean government together. And so those people, as the new folks who are coming into the neighborhood who were not traditionally there, they're flocking to Longo. They're not necessarily going to the other side. Sam, remind me, what was the first part of that question?
The other part of that was, did Longo ever try, or sorry, did Hague ever try to buy off Longo and offer him a job? Yeah, it's a great question. The research is still ongoing here. And the pandemic has slowed down some of this research because his papers, John Longo's papers, are at the New Jersey Historical Society. He donated them in 1977. And we really need to get into those. And so there are some additional things. There's a lot more to dig into. At this point, I have no evidence that Hague tried to offer him a job. It's a very, very good question. I think the answer is, based on everything that Longo has demonstrated, I cannot possibly imagine that he would have taken him up on it. But it's a great question, and it's absolutely on our list of things to look for and see if we can find evidence of it. But as yet, nope. We have a few questions here asking about how this situation, the Longo-Hague feud, if you will, translates to today. One of the questions is, do you see something like, would this have played out today differently than it did then? The other question is, what were some of the implications that we still have today? Is New Jersey politics today built on either Hague or Longo's legacy? And toward that end, was Longo ever recognized perhaps later, or is he recognized today for the heroic acts that he took then. And a lot of times, I think with these events in history, we recognize them much after the event, right? Hugh Thompson wasn't recognized for ending the My Lai massacre until 20, 30 years later. Now, as we kind of look back on this as a historic time, does John Longo get praise and recognition that maybe he didn't always get back then?
It's a really great question. I would say that if you look at the scholarship and you look at if you look at the resources that are out there, whether it's the New York Times, the places that covered the latter portion of his career, the places that reflected on his career after his death, the historic treatment has been very, very favorable to him. And one of the reasons why it was a question that I thought I would get, but that nobody asked, which is my objectivity in this. One of the things that has made this easy for me to feel like I can kind of be objective is that to a certain extent, history started to write this already, that he came out on the good end of this, that he was completely exonerated and that his actions were just over time. I think that, and Hague's legacy is very, very muddy. It's very complicated, still seen as a boss. And I included that picture of the actor who played him in Boardwalk Empire, not a favorable depiction at all. But in terms of anything that's really substantial, I'll tell you one of the things that I worry about in terms of his legacy is that as people age, the more we're sort of losing the people who understood what John Longo meant to Jersey City, that if you're not really kind of going back into the archives and looking at things, you're not really going to know, because there's no public monument to him. Like I said, the zoning board in March voted to tear down the building that housed the John R. Longo Association. I was on Zoom on that zoning board meeting, and somebody kind of, dismissively said, maybe we'll put a plaque up there. We're going to put some apartments. Maybe we'll put a plaque up there. And so that my sister and I said the next day, we said, all right, so the next step is we're going to get a plaque up there. So I think that it is up to those of us who know this story to make sure that he is more cemented in the history than he already is, because I think it does sort of fade over time. The local stories, it's the big picture people that we're often left with, and these kind of local folks don't really necessarily get the attention that they deserve. In terms of how this plays out today, I think it's a fascinating exercise in speculation, really is. And I'd love to see, the John R. Longo Twitter account. Like, does John R. Longo get banned from Twitter? Probably. I don't know. It was kind of in his character to be, to kind of be provocative and push the envelope. And so in terms of how this plays out today, it's hard. Does he get more traction? Does he get more followers because his national audience is easier to connect to, easier to communicate with? Or is it kind of easier to shut him up? I don't know. But I think he was somebody who would use every means at his disposal. And so I kind of think that this would absolutely be sort of something that would play out in the digital sphere. Very interesting to explore.
Two final questions when I wrap up with. The first one, a few people have kind of voiced this. Do you see parallels between Longo and Hague and politicians today? And the question specifically touches on those running for president. So whether Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, those who have run the past, are there parallels to those who call out corruption and those who perhaps are vested in the corrupt machine? I would add the caveat, just being in that world myself, that you don't run for president unless you want a degree of power, and unless you have a degree of arrogance that you think you can actually solve the problems in the world. And so I would add that caveat that anyone who runs for president is not quite as clean as they would like people to think they are. But with that caveat, are there parallels that you see? I know nothing's going to be perfect, but are there parallels that you see between Longo and Hague and some of the presidential candidates that we've all been familiar with the last few cycles?
It's a great question. And I really appreciate your caveat, because as I mentioned, Longo never won anything. He never won anything. And he tried very briefly and then wasn't very interested in it. He didn't really care about the power. So even when you think about how far he goes, he doesn't say I'm going to go do something bigger, right? I'm going to go run for governor. you know, forget about this mayoral thing. He's not interested in the power at all. He saw a problem and he wanted to fix it. And he believed the best way for him to do it. He was a son of Jersey City. He had no interest. I mean, he provided commentary on national issues, but he wanted to fix, you know, this place that, you know, that gave birth to him and his ideals. So I think for him, it's so hard to come up with a parallel because he's just such a unique force of nature. And I really can't think of anybody who said, probably because we're also focused on national figures as well and not local figures, but I just need to fix this problem. And so, so even to kind of make a national comparison is really tricky. With Hague, the thing that I worry about is he had such a Machiavellian approach, and I do worry about that in politics in general. That sometimes, and you could speak to this better than I can, but I worry that sometimes our politicians are so interested in whatever the end result is. And sometimes that might benefit us, the people, sometimes it really benefits them. And there's a growing disparity between the politicians and the people. And the rhetoric can be for the people, but that doesn't mean the reality is. And so I see, and maybe this is sort of cynical, I see Hague in a lot of people today. A lot of politicians who kind of give us the rhetoric that this is for you, I'm here for you, I'm doing this for you, and it's really not. That it's really that there's some personal gain, and of course the amassing of power on their end. So I'll stay away from too political a response by providing any names, but there are some Hagues out there,
I think that is a great segue here into this last question. And to your point, Professor Johnston, I think you're talking about the idea of the end justifying the means a lot in politics. And yet our government is set up where the means matter. And the Constitution is fundamentally about the means. It's a structure, it's a process, it's a protocol. So we have a government that is set up, focused on the means, and yet we have a system that focuses on the end. And perhaps that's where some of that conflict comes in. But it does lead us into this last question, which is from Dean Patrick Grubbs. And he asks, what does this story and your research on the Longo and Hague rivalry, how does this lead us to teach about politics, but also how does this lead us to teach about life?
Oh, it's such a profound question, Dean Grubbs. I think there are lessons in how we should live our life here, right? And I tried to sort of end that way with kind of a, broader message as opposed to one that's too grounded in any sort of specific historical moment. But I think at the end of the day, we all have to be able to look ourselves in the mirror. And we all have to say, did I like what I did today? Am I comfortable with the things I did today? At the end of Hague's life, yeah, he had a lot of money. He had a lot of houses. He had a lot of people that were indebted to him until the day he died. Longo never got rich. There are those of us who are still fighting for him to be remembered. But if I had to pick, and again, I'm biased, but if I had to pick, do I want to be a Hague or do I want to be a Longo, which I happen to be? Do I want to be a Hague or do I want to be a Longo? I'm going to pick a Longo every time. And I think this was something, when you talk about how do you live, the real research, the academic scholarship on this started, I think, in earnest in the past couple of years, with my sister and I starting to really dig into this. But in some way, this was the story of our family growing up. That, okay, poor idealistic John Longo, he didn't win fights, but my goodness, he has integrity. I'll tell you a quick story that I hope helps to answer this as well. So John Longo never won anything, but his younger brother, Mo Longo, ran for mayor of Jersey City in the 1970s. He lost that, but he was elected county freeholder and county registrar. And he ran on a pro-integrity platform. And he had a little jingle that said, Longo has integrity. And when the feds started looking into the corruption in Jersey City politics, they tapped the phones of a number of the public officials in Jersey City. They got everybody on these corruption charges, except for Mo Longo. And the FBI notes said, Longo can't be bought. That was his brother's legacy, right? So that was what his brother passed on to him, is don't ever let anybody buy you. So there are things that might look glamorous in the moment, the power that comes with politics, even the things that you can practically get done, even if you're not in it for greed, even if you're in it because you really believe in advancing, you know, something that matters, even if you believe in the ends. But if you do it in the wrong way, then you have to be able to sit with yourself on that. And so what I love about this story is I feel like it does, to Dean Grubbs's point, it does kind of bridge the gap between what we learn from history, but also what we learn about ourselves in the process of studying history.
Well, that's fantastic. And we're going to close there as it is noon now. I just want to say thank you again to Professor Johnston for joining us. And this is a fantastic way to kick off our 2021-2022 Spartan Talk series. So Lisa, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun. And thanks to everybody for your wonderful questions.
Chris, we want to thank all of you for tuning in, and we want to invite you back here next week. So there will be another email that goes out, and next week we have another Spartan Talk, and we are with Professor of Psychology, Brittany Whitman, and she's going to be talking about how we use nature to calm, connect, and increase our creativity. And so I think in this day and age, there's a lot of need, especially with all the stress that we have, to connect with nature and to, I mean, I'm always up to find ways to calm down. And so we want to invite you right back here at 11 o'clock next Thursday for that Spartan Talk. But again, Professor Johnston, thank you for your time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. If you have additional questions, by all means, please reach out. We can get those questions to Professor Johnston. I know she would love to hear from all of you. And so with that, thank you. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you next week.